The judge demanded she take off her Medal of Honor the moment she stepped to the witness stand, and his voice was sharp like a snapped ruler. "No symbols in my court," he said, pointing at the blue ribbon on her chest, and Lena Ortiz felt every eye lock on her like a spotlight. But she did not touch the medal because it was not a symbol to her. It was a promise, and she had kept harder promises in harder places than this quiet room. Lena was 32, small and steady, wearing a plain gray sweater and black pants, and the medal sat at her throat like a heavy coin, and she stood there because the Navy had called her a troublemaker, and the shipyard owner had called her the truth, and the court had called her witness. But Lena only called herself the one who saw. The judge, Judge Halden Bricks, leaned forward and said again, louder, "Remove it now." And the Navy lawyer at the front table, Mr. Creel, gave a thin smile like he had been waiting for this, and Lena understood the trap right away. If she obeyed, she would look weak and ashamed. If she refused, she would look rude and angry. And either way, the room would stop listening to what she came to say. Lena took one slow breath and said, "Your Honor, that medal belongs in this room more than I do." And the judge's face tightened, and he snapped, "This is not a debate." And the bailiff took one step closer. Lena glanced at the rows behind her and saw faces she did not know, and faces she knew too well, like Ms. Harper, the shipyard owner's wife, clutching a folder so hard her knuckles were white, and old Mr. Darnell in the back wearing a cap that said veteran, staring at Lena like he was hoping she would not break, and two reporters raising their phones as if they could film honor and shame like a show. Mr. Creel stood and said, "Your Honor, we asked the witness to comply. This court must stay neutral." And he said neutral like it meant quiet, like it meant don't talk about what we did. Lena turned her eyes back to the judge and said, "If you want me to tell the truth, let me wear the truth." And the judge's gavel hit wood, hard, and the sound made the whole room jump. "Last warning," Judge Brick said. "Remove it or I will hold you in contempt." Lena felt the word contempt land like a threat, and she knew what it meant. Handcuffs, a cell, the story changing from Navy fraud to witness causes scene, and she could almost hear the Navy press office already writing that headline. Still, Lena did not move, because the medal was not only metal, and she did not wear it for praise. She wore it because of the people who never got to speak. She wore it because of Chief Weller, who died shouting into a radio that never answered. She wore it because of Private Louise Cade, who pushed Lena out of the blast door and took the fire meant for her. She wore it because the Navy had tried to bury a mistake under paperwork and flags. Judge Brick stared at her and said, "Bailiff," and the bailiff reached for Lena's neck, and Lena's heart thumped, and for a second her hands wanted to rise and protect that ribbon, but she forced them to stay down because she had learned in war that panic makes you small, and she would not be small today. The bailiff's fingers touched the ribbon, and the room went silent, and then a voice from the benches said, "Don't," and it was not loud, but it was strong, and it came from Mr. Darnell, the old veteran, who stood up with slow knees and said, "That medal ain't jewelry." Judge Brick snapped, "Sit down," and Mr. Darnell did not sit, and then another person stood, a woman with a short haircut and a cane, and she said, "My son died overseas. Don't shame that medal." The judge's face reddened, and he shouted for order, and the bailiff paused, unsure, and Lena saw the power shift in tiny ways, like sand moving under a boot. Mr. Creel rushed in with a smooth voice, "Your Honor, we can't let this turn into a parade," and Lena wanted to laugh at that word parade, because she had marched behind too many coffins to ever want a parade again. Lena said, "I'm not here to be honored. I'm here because people are dead." The judge hit the gavel again and said, "Answer the question. Will you remove it?" Lena looked at him and said, "No," and the word was plain, not brave-sounding, just true. The judge's eyes narrowed, and in that moment Lena noticed something she had missed before. The judge wore a ring with a dark stone, and on the stone was a tiny anchor mark, like a Navy sign, and it made Lena's stomach tighten, because judges did not wear service rings by accident, and she wondered who Judge Bricks really was loyal to. Judge Bricks said, "Then you leave me no choice," and he nodded at the bailiff, and the bailiff lifted both hands toward the ribbon again, and Lena felt anger rise, not hot and wild, but cold and sharp, because the judge was trying to strip her of the one thing that kept her steady. Lena could have fought, but she didn't because she needed this court to hear the bigger fight. So she did something else. She lifted her chin and said, "If you remove it, do it gently." And the bailiff blinked, and Lena added, "Because it belongs to the United States, not to you." The bailiff hesitated, and his eyes flicked to the judge and then to Mr. Creel, and Lena saw something in the bailiff's face that looked like shame. He carefully slipped the ribbon over Lena's head and held the medal in his palm. And for a second Lena felt bare, like someone had pulled off a bandage too soon, and the reporters' phones lifted higher, and Mr. Creel's smile widened. And Judge Bricks sat back, satisfied, as if he had proven a point. "Proceed," the judge said, and Lena gripped the edge of the witness stand, and she promised herself she would not let this be the end. Mr. Creel walked toward her like a shark that smelled blood and said, "Captain Ortiz, you claim you saw fraud in Navy contracts, correct?" Lena said, "Yes," and he said, "Yet you come here wearing a medal, asking for special respect." And Lena said, "I asked for nothing." And he said, "You refused a lawful order." And Lena said, "I refused disrespect." And the judge cut in, "Answer only what you are asked." And Lena swallowed hard because the court was trying to squeeze her into a narrow box where truth could not fit. Mr. Creel held up a stack of papers and said, "These are official records. They show the parts were delivered, inspected, and approved." And Lena said, "Those records are lies." And a gasp ran through the room because people are trained to believe paper more than people. Mr. Creel nodded like he expected that and said, "So you claim a large group of officers and inspectors made up a story, and you alone know better?" Lena said, "I don't know better. I know what I saw." Mr. Creel's voice turned sweet and cruel at the same time. "What you saw," he said, "was a stressful mission, poor lighting, and your own fear." And Lena felt her cheeks burn because he was doing the oldest trick, turning facts into feelings, turning a witness into a confused person. Lena leaned forward and said, "I was not confused when a rescue helicopter dropped from the sky." And the room froze, and the judge's eyebrows rose, and Mr. Creel's smile faltered for the first time. Lena went on, "We were told it was enemy fire. It was not. It was a cracked rotor housing that should have been replaced months earlier." Mr. Creel snapped, "Speculation," and the judge said, "Sustained," and Lena's chest tightened, because every time she tried to speak the real story, the court cut her off like a knife trimming fat for meat. Lena forced her voice to stay steady. "I have proof," she said, and Mr. Creel laughed softly. "Do you?" he asked. But do you have anger?" The judge leaned forward and said, "Do you have proof, Captain?" And Lena said, "Yes. It's in the medal." And the room made a strange sound, half laugh, half whisper, because it sounded impossible, and Judge Bricks frowned as if Lena had just made a joke in church. "Explain," the judge ordered. Lena looked at the bailiff, who still held the medal, and said, "Turn it over." And the bailiff obeyed. And the judge said, "What are we doing?" And Lena said, "When the Navy took my security badge, they thought they took my access. They didn't think I'd use the only thing they wouldn't search." Mr. Creel stood so fast his chair scraped loud. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he said. And Lena said, "Open the clasp." And the bailiff's fingers found a tiny seam hidden inside the medal, and his eyes widened when it clicked, and he pulled out something no one expected. A thin black chip, smaller than a fingernail, sealed inside the medal. The courtroom erupted into voices, and the judge slammed the gavel, shouting, "Order!" But even his gavel sounded scared now. Mr. Creel's face turned pale, and Lena said, "That chip holds a flight log, a parts report, and an audio file from the night the helicopter fell." The judge's mouth opened and closed like he had swallowed air wrong. "How did you get this?" he demanded. Lena said, "Because they left me alone with the wreckage for 6 minutes while they secured cameras and cleaned the scene." And her voice shook with controlled rage now, because she remembered those 6 minutes too well. The smell of burnt oil, the screaming, the hard choice between helping a dying friend and grabbing the truth before it disappeared. "I copied what I could," she said, "because I knew they would erase the rest." Mr. Creel snapped, "Chain of custody." And the judge said, "We will address that," but his eyes were fixed on the chip like it was a snake in his hand. The judge asked the clerk to mark it as an exhibit, and Mr. Creel protested, and the judge allowed a brief recess, and suddenly the courtroom became a storm of whispers and fast footsteps. Lena sat on the witness chair while lawyers huddled, and she felt her pulse pounding in her ears, and she wondered if she had just won or just painted a target on her back. When the hearing resumed, the judge looked different, tighter, like his calm had cracked, and he said, "We will hear the audio," and Mr. Creel's head snapped up in alarm. "Your Honor, we object," he said, "national security," and Lena almost laughed again, because they always hid behind those two words like a curtain. The judge hesitated, then said, "We will hear it in chambers," and Lena's stomach dropped because in chambers meant behind closed doors, where truth could be bent and buried. Lena said, "No," and the judge's eyes flashed. "Captain," he warned, "you will not instruct this court," and Lena said, "If you play it in private, they will say it never happened," and the room stirred, and Mr. Darnell stood again, and someone else shouted, "Let us hear it," and the judge pounded the gavel until his arm shook. "Silence," he shouted, and the sound finally fell away, but the anger stayed, hanging like smoke. The judge leaned toward Lena and said, quieter but colder, "You are on thin ice," and Lena said, "So were my friends," and for a moment the judge's eyes flickered like he felt something, but then the flicker died, and he said, "We will proceed my way," and he nodded to the clerk to take the chip out of the room, and Lena watched it leave her sight, and fear stabbed her, because that chip was the heart of her whole fight. Mr. Creel smirked again, and Lena realized the judge might not be neutral at all, and then the second conflict hit like a slammed door. Two uniformed Navy police officers stepped into the courtroom and stood by the exit, and the judge acted as if they were normal, as if it was nothing, and Lena felt the hairs on her neck rise because she knew that posture, that quiet control before grab. Judge Brick said, "Captain Ortiz, you are reminded that disclosure of classified material is a crime." And Lena said, "It's not classified. It's criminal." And the judge's jaw clenched, and he said, "We will decide what it is." And Lena understood then that the court was not only testing her, it was trying to cage her. Mr. Creel stood and said, "Your Honor, in light of this witness's behavior, we request she be taken into custody for contempt and for unlawful handling of military data." And the two Navy officers shifted their feet like they were ready, and the crowd gasped, and Lena's mouth went dry, because if they arrested her now, the chip would vanish forever. She looked at the judge and saw something chilling. He looked almost relieved, like this was the clean ending he wanted. The judge said, "Captain Ortiz," and before he could finish, the courtroom doors opened again, hard, and a voice called out, "Stop!" And it was not a shout, but it carried like thunder. Everyone turned. A tall man in a dark uniform stepped in, older, silver hair, shoulders set like steel, the kind of person whose presence changes how a room breathes, and behind him came two people in plain suits with badges clipped to their belts. The bailiff said, stunned, "Admiral," and the Navy officers snapped to attention without thinking. Admiral Grant Huxley walked down the aisle with slow steps, eyes locked on the judge, and said, "Judge Bricks, you will not remove evidence from this courtroom." And the judge's face went white, and for a second he looked like a man caught stealing. Mr. Creel stammered, "Admiral, this is—" and Admiral Huxley cut him off with one raised hand. "Sit down," he said, and Mr. Creel sat like the air had pushed him. The judge tried to recover. "Admiral Huxley," he said, forcing a smile, "this is a civilian court." And the Admiral said, "And this is a civilian crime." And he held up a paper and said, "Federal warrant." And the two people in suits stepped forward, and Lena's heart jumped because she had dreamed of this moment and feared it too. Someone powerful finally coming to the light. The Admiral looked at Lena, and his eyes softened for half a second, and then he turned to the judge again and said, "You asked her to remove her medal," and Judge Bricks said, "Court decorum," and the Admiral said, "No, control," and that word hit the room like a slap. The judge's voice shook. "Admiral, I don't know what you think," and the Admiral said, "I think you have been helping Commander Creel hide broken parts, fake inspections, and deaths." And the crowd exploded into whispers and shocked cries, and the judge's gavel slammed, but it sounded small now, because the Admiral's voice filled the room. Lena felt tears sting her eyes, not from relief, but from rage, because it had taken so long, and so many people had paid the price before anyone listened. The judge stood up fast. "This is outrageous," he said. "I will not be accused." And the admiral said, "Then explain the ring." And he pointed at the judge's hand, and the judge froze, and the room stared, and Lena saw it again, that dark stone with the anchor mark. Admiral Huxley said, "That ring is given to members of the Harbor Circle," and the words made the veterans in the back sit straighter. "Because some secrets have a smell, and they knew it." The admiral said, "Harbor Circle is not a club. It's a network. Officers, contractors, and yes, even a judge." And Judge Brick shouted, "Lies," but his voice cracked. Mr. Creel tried to stand, but one of the suited agents put a hand on his shoulder and pushed him back down like he was a child. Lena's hand was shaking now, and she hated that because she had trained herself not to shake, but this was different because this was justice trying to break through a wall. The admiral nodded to the clerk. "Bring the chip back," he ordered, and the clerk looked at the judge, then at the admiral, then back at the judge, and finally hurried out, and Lena held her breath until the clerk returned with the chip in a small evidence bag, and she could breathe again. The admiral said, "Play the audio. Here, now," and the judge looked trapped, and he whispered to his clerk, and the clerk connected the file to the courtroom speakers. Mr. Creel's face looked sick. The room went silent. Then the audio began, scratchy at first, wind and rotor noise, then a voice calm and firm, saying, "Leave it. Do not replace the housing. We need that bird in the air." Lena felt her stomach twist because she knew that voice. The room heard another voice, scared, saying, "Sir, it's cracked," and the first voice replied, I gave an order." And then the scared voice said, "People could die," and the first voice said, "The contract closes at midnight. Make it work." And then the audio cut to frantic shouting, alarms, and Lena's own voice screaming, "Hold on," and then a blast sound that made people flinch, and then silence, deep and awful. When the audio ended, the courtroom did not breathe for a long second. Then Judge Brick spoke, soft, "That proves nothing," but even he sounded like he did not believe himself. Lena stared at the admiral, waiting for him to name the voice, waiting for the truth to be said out loud, and Admiral Huxley said, "The voice giving that order belongs to Rear Admiral Mason Keene," and the room erupted again because that was a famous name, the kind of name on speeches and plaques. Lena's hands clenched because she remembered how they blamed enemy fire and then pinned medals on the survivors like tape over a leak. Judge Bricks's face went stiff and strange. "Keene is not here," he said quickly, and the admiral said, "No, but you are," and the judge blinked, and the admiral added, "Because you are Mason Keene." The words hit like lightning. The room gasped. Some people shouted, "What?" And Lena felt the floor tilt under her because she had not seen it, not fully until now. The judge's age, the shape of his jaw, the way he held authority like he had worn it in uniform before, and Lena's mind flashed to old briefings where she had seen Rear Admiral Keene from far away, never close, always surrounded by staff, and how his face had always been half shadow, and how after the crash the Navy said he retired for health. And suddenly, Judge Bricks appeared in a quiet county court, and it all snapped together like a lock closing. Lena's heart pounded so hard it hurt. The judge shouted, "That is insane!" But the admiral turned to the suited agents and said, "Run the ID," and one agent held up a tablet and said, "Fingerprint match confirmed," and the room burst into chaos. Judge Bricks backed away from the bench like a man who thought he could still outrun his past. "This is a mistake," he said, and his voice finally lost its judge tone and became a scared man's voice. Lena stared at him, shocked and furious, because the person who tried to strip her medal had ordered the deadly shortcut that made her earn it. Mr. Creel tried to bolt, but the other agent grabbed him, and the Navy officers looked torn because they were trained to obey rank, and now rank was wearing a robe and being called a criminal. Admiral Huxley stepped closer to the bench and said, "You changed your name, took a judge seat, and used decorum to block a witness." And the judge shook his head fast, sweating. "I serve this country," he hissed. Lena could not hold back anymore. She stood up and said loud, "So did they," and her voice echoed, and she pointed at the medal the bailiff still held, and she said, "You told them a cracked part was fine," and her eyes burned, and she said, Louise K. died because of you." The judge's face twisted, like he wanted to deny it, but the audio had already spoken. Admiral Huxley turned to Lena and held out the medal, and the bailiff handed it to him, and the admiral placed it gently back around Lena's neck, and the ribbon settled on her shoulders like a weight returning home. "I'm sorry," the admiral said, and it was the first time anyone with stars on their shoulders had said those words to her. Lena swallowed hard and said, "Sorry doesn't bring them back," and the admiral nodded because he knew. The judge, no longer safe behind his bench, shouted, "You can't do this," and the agent said, "We can," and they moved in, and Judge Bricks raised his hands like he wanted to argue, then like he wanted to fight, then like he wanted to beg, but the handcuffs clicked shut, and the sound was clean and final, and Lena felt a cold relief spread through her chest that did not feel like joy, because justice is not joy when it comes after graves. Mr. Creel screamed that the audio was stolen, that the metal was tampered, that none of it would hold, and the admiral said, "We already have the rest," and that was another twist inside the twist, because Lena realized she had not been alone. Someone else had been collecting pieces too, and Admiral Huxley looked at the gallery and said, "This hearing will continue under federal oversight," and the crowd began to clap. Not polite claps, but hard claps that sounded like anger finally getting a voice. Lena did not clap. She only stood there, breathing, feeling the metal press against her chest, and she thought about Louise's laugh, Chief Weller's stubborn grin, the way the helicopter had dropped like a stone, and the way officials had smiled at funerals while hiding broken parts in clean folders. The judge, Mason Keene, was led toward the door, and as he passed Lena, he turned his head and looked at her with eyes full of hate and fear, and he whispered, "You think this makes you a hero?" And Lena leaned toward him and whispered back, "No, it makes me a witness." And for the first time his face showed real panic, because heroes can be praised and ignored, but witnesses do not go away. When the doors closed behind him, the courtroom felt like it had been holding poison and finally spit it out, and people began to talk all at once, and reporters rushed out to shout into microphones, and the shipyard owner's wife started crying in the front row because she had feared nobody would believe them, and the veteran in the back sat down slow, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand like he hated that he was crying in public. Admiral Huxley stepped toward Lena and said, "Captain Ortiz, you are not under arrest," and Lena almost laughed at how small that sounded compared to everything else, and she said, "I never should have been," and the admiral nodded. "You will be protected," he said, and Lena stared at him because she had heard promises before, and she said, "Protect the next crew," and the admiral said, "That's why I'm here," and he held up another folder thick with pages and said, "We found the Harbor Circle accounts." And the room went quiet again, because people realized this was bigger than one crash, bigger than one medal, bigger than one judge, and Lena felt a fresh wave of anger because it meant more families, more lies, more graves, but she also felt something else, something sharp and painful and new, a small hope that the truth might finally stop the bleeding. The clerk called the court back to order under a new temporary judge brought in by video, and the case moved forward fast now, like a dam had broken, and Lena answered questions again, but this time the questions were about facts, not about her pride, and each answer she gave felt like pushing a heavy stone off a road, so others could pass. When the hearing ended hours later, Lena walked out into the cold air, and cameras flashed, and strangers shouted her name, and some people tried to thank her, but Lena kept moving because she did not want their praise, she wanted their memory. On the steps, Mr. Darnell caught up to her and said, "You did right," and Lena looked at him and said, "I did late," and he shook his head. "Truth is always late," he said, "but it still shows up if you keep the door open," and Lena touched the metal lightly, feeling the tiny hidden seam where the chip had been, and she thought about how close the truth had come to being locked away in a private room, how close she had come to cuffs, how close the judge had come to winning again, and she understood that the hardest battles are not always loud ones. Sometimes they happen in quiet rooms with rules and polite words, where power tries to look clean. Lena stepped down the courthouse stairs and did not look back because she had spent too long staring at the past, and she had work to do now, not for medals, not for headlines, but for the dead who could not speak, and the living who still had to fly in machines they trusted. And as the wind tugged at the pale blue ribbon at her throat, she held her head steady and walked forward, knowing the fight was not over, but also knowing that the biggest lie in the room had finally been named, and once a lie has a name, it cannot hide as easily again.